Welcome back, everybody. I hope all of you that spent some time with us at the first session with Shane enjoyed it. Very much looking forward to our next speaker, Kathleen. Before we get started, just a reminder that all these sessions will be recorded. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We love to keep them interactive and budgeted time at the end for Q&A. So I encourage you to ask any questions or have comments in the chat feature, and we will address those at the end. And again, as well, we will be sending out a survey to solicit some feedback. And if you have an opportunity to fill that out, we really do appreciate it because it helps us mold our programming as we move forward. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm excited about having Kathleen Bilderbach join us. Just a little background on her. She is a graduate from St. Louis University with degrees in accounting and theater, received her law degree in taxation from Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. She specializes in estate, business, and executive benefit planning, estate and executive compensation planning with life insurance. She formerly was a member of the Advanced Markets Group at MetLife, where she provided training and advanced underwriting support for top producers of for MetLife and its subsidiaries. Prior to joining Gen America Financial, a MetLife company in '96, she was in private practice. She is a member of the Missouri, Illinois, Pennsylvania bars, as well as an active member in the American Bar Association and the Bar Association of Metropolitan St. Louis. She is a nationally recognized speaker and author and an adjunct professor at the Washington University School of Law. And she's also a founding member of her firm, Affinity Law Group. Bottom line, she knows what she's talking about. We're very excited to have her. She's going to share some insights on opportunities with businesses in a post-pandemic COVID world. So Kathleen, I'm going to turn it over to you and look forward to your time with us today.
Okay, so we are going to talk today about opportunities for healthy businesses in a post-COVID world. Because as Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So really you can divide businesses post-COVID into two broad categories. Unhealthy businesses, which are trying to struggle to survive or trying to figure out the most efficient way to shut down, and healthy businesses, for which there are a number of opportunities. And we're going to talk about some of those opportunities today. Specifically, we're going to talk about acquisitions, recruiting and retention, and management succession. We're also going to talk a little bit about potential changes in the tax laws. And I did leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So please keep your questions coming. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about acquisitions. My firm has a very robust mergers and acquisitions practice, and we have seen a lot of activity since about the middle of last year. And those acquisitions have taken a number of forms. It may be one healthy company acquiring an unhealthy company, maybe a competitor. We've also seen companies acquiring businesses that are not in their industry as a diversification strategy. And finally, we've seen a lot of companies acquiring either suppliers or customers for purposes of vertical integration. So where were we in 2020? Well, we had a bunch of deals teed up first quarter of last year, and of course they all ground to a halt once COVID hit. But the second half of 2020 saw a huge comeback due to a combination of factors. One is higher company valuations. The companies that survived and thrived were all getting higher valuations. And when I say valuation, what am I talking about? We're looking at the market value of the company plus debt minus cash. So much higher valuations in the second half of last year. In addition, we saw higher multiples. That is a multiple of EBITDA. So if you take the enterprise value and divide it by the company's EBITDA, that's earning before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, that's going to give you a multiple, sometimes expressed as 10x, let's say 10 times EBITDA. There's also much more access to capital. Banks have money and they want to lend it, but it's not just traditional lenders who want to put their capital to work in the market. And we're going to talk about some of those alternative financing sources in just a minute. Of course, the ongoing low interest rate environment has meant that money is cheaper to borrow. So for companies that need to borrow money in order to do an acquisition, now's a great time. And finally, we see a lot of unhealthy businesses trying to survive by divesting themselves of unprofitable divisions or by merging with other companies. So the last half of 2020 through today and foreseeable through the end of 2021 is a hotbed of M&A activity. So let's say that you're working with a client that wants to acquire another business. What should that buyer be looking for in the target? Well, first, the buyer wants the target to have a sustainable competitive advantage. And I'll give you an example of a company that we've been working with that does not have a sustainable competitive advantage. It's a company that's in the printing business. Basically, they specialize in printing those circulars that you get in the newspaper every week, all the sales at the grocery store. Well, as you can imagine, that market has been shrinking, and our client has been seeking to be acquired by another company. Unfortunately, they have dated equipment, they're in a dated industry, so they have not been successful. We're helping them figure out a strategy to liquidate. Definable sales growth. Buyers are looking for year-over-year sales growth. Now, that's not always true, of course, if they're looking at unhealthy businesses as a potential target, a way of taking out a competitor, that may shift the sales growth being an important component here, but generally they're looking for definable sales growth. Also, how much cash is falling to the bottom line? It's great if a company has a lot of revenue, but if it also has a lot of expenses, it might not make a good target. Again, back to the growing industry. Buyers really want targets in a growing industry. Appropriate legal structure. And that doesn't just mean whether the company is established as a corporation or an LLC. It also means, is the company registered to do business in every state that it does business? You'd be surprised at how often we find that the company is not properly registered. Or have they kept adequate corporate records? Have they kept minutes? It's not unusual for a client to come in and want to sell their business, and we have to go back and recreate minutes for the past 15 years. So appropriate legal structure is very important. A strong and motivated management team, and we're going to talk about some ways in just a minute to motivate that management team. And realistic transaction expectations. This is one problem that we've seen a lot during the pandemic. Sellers have overvalued their companies. That's because they're looking at pre-COVID values, not what the company is worth today. So realistic transaction expectations are very important to the buyer. So what should a seller look for in a buyer? Well, first of all, the financial ability to close. That's the most important. Either they have the cash on hand and it can be funded. Perhaps there's an earnout strategy, but one way or another, the buyer has to pay. Adaptability. Now, this is especially important in the COVID world. So, for example, we have a client in Southern Missouri, and this client was in the business of fabrication of certain tents and other industrial applications. They pivoted very close to the beginning of the pandemic to produce masks. And because of their adaptability, they are now have a couple LOIs out there that they want to be acquired by other potential buyers in the same industry. Technologically savvy, that's become more important as well. Zoom is the new reality. Zoom, Teams. I talked to another professional this morning about a common client, and he informed me that his firm has just gotten rid of phones. They don't have phones anymore. everything is going through the computer, more technology. Also, it helps if the buyer is knowledgeable about the industry. That doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer has to be in the same industry, because if the buyer is trying to diversify, of course, they're seeking targets in other industries. It has to be a good cultural fit. If you have a client who's interested in selling and they have a culture where everybody can wear jeans to work every day, if they are acquired by a buyer where everybody wears suits every day, that's not going to be a good cultural fit, and it's not going to work out. Also, if we're looking at a financial buyer, that is someone who's buying the company to grow it and eventually sell it, it's important that they be experienced. That's a very niche area. So it's very important that they have a number of successful past deals. So what are the terms of a lot of these acquisitions? Well, if I'm representing the seller, I want to structure the sale as a stock sale. If I'm representing the buyer, I want to structure as an asset sale. The reason for that is, if you sell the stock, all of the liabilities, whether known or unknown, pass to the buyer by virtue of his or her or its purchase of the stock. Whereas if the buyer just acquires the assets, they don't acquire any of the liabilities. So what are we seeing in terms of financing? Well, as I mentioned, banks have money to lend. So traditional financing, we're seeing a lot of activity. Again, the interest rates are very low, so it's the perfect combination of available cash and low interest rates. But we're also seeing a lot of activity in the private equity area and venture capital. So let me give you an example of one of our private equity clients. We have a private equity client who is in the hospitality industry. He puts together funds which private investors contribute to for an interest in the fund. Then our client uses those funds to acquire various hotel properties. So that's an example of a private equity investment fund. And typically those private equity investment funds are looking for established businesses versus venture capital firms, which are typically looking for startup businesses, early stage businesses with a tremendous amount of growth. So we're seeing a lot of activity on the private investment side as well. Then we also see deals with seller financing, and we're going to get into some details about seller financing in just a minute. So let's talk about some of the most important terms on the acquisition side: warranties, representations, and indemnities. So representations and warranties, typically the buyer and the seller in the agreement, whether it's an asset purchase agreement or a stock purchase agreement, are making certain warranties and representations about facts. And those facts are what is leading the other party into entering into the agreement. So the facts may be extremely simple, like I own the stock and there are no liens against it. I am not required under any contract that applies to not be able to sell my stock or not be able to sell the assets. It could be more complicated. So for example, we represented a financial services firm, and one of the warranties and representations that they had to make in that case was about their privacy practices and the extent that they go to keep the client's information private. In addition, because of the PPP under the CARES Act, the Paycheck Protection Program, we're seeing a lot in these agreements now, warranties and representations with regard to PPP funds. For example, if we're working on a deal right now, the client, the target, has not expended all of their second round PPP funds yet. The buyer is requiring the seller to put those funds into escrow. If the loan is forgiven, those funds will be released to the seller. If the loan is not forgiven, those funds will be returned to the lender. In addition, our clients have had to make several warranties and representations that they use the money appropriately and they expect forgiveness. So that's something that's changed. So what happens if these warranties and representations turn out not to be true? We also have indemnification provisions in these agreements. The indemnification provisions say basically, if our warranties and representations turn out not to be true, buyer, we will make you whole, for example. So it keeps potentially the parties on the hook. Most of our time, most of my mergers and acquisitions department attorney's time is spent in negotiating these warranties, representations, and indemnification. For example, you would not want that indemnification if you're the seller to go on indefinitely. So we're trying to limit the time on those indemnification provisions, or maybe the amount of total indemnification. We also may have purchase price adjustment provisions in the agreement. So what happens if the company is worth significantly less, for example, than the buyer assumed at the time of the purchase? Let's say that they lost a huge customer immediately after the purchase. There may be in the agreement a negotiated purchase price adjustment that would allow the buyer to get some of their money back. Also, we're seeing a lot of deferred compensation arrangements being used in acquisitions. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's talk for a minute about seller financing. Seller financing is basically where the seller takes back a note from the buyer, which is typically paid back over time. So when we're advising clients on seller financing, we're suggesting that they get as close to traditional lender terms as possible. So in terms of interest rate, maybe a higher interest rate, definitely not a lower interest rate. Also, we're advising clients to get guarantees, personal guarantees from the buyer, or pledges of assets or pledges of the stock or other equity. We're advising them to file UCCs, which basically you file with the state. It puts everybody on notice that you have an interest in the assets of the company. But the reality is, if a portion of the purchase price was financed by a traditional lender, they're going to want the seller note to be subordinate to their note. We also want the terms of this financing to limit the amount of total debt to which the seller note will subordinate. So for example, perhaps it's a senior lender, a traditional lender, a bank, then the seller note, but then we would want, representing the seller, for any line of credit to be subordinate to the seller's note. And we advise sellers to consider purchasing life insurance on the life of the buyer, so that if something happens to the buyer, the seller can be made whole. That life insurance sale may take the form of term insurance, but can also take the form of permanent insurance. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Typically, we want the insurance to at least cover the term of the note. In reality, as opposed to the ideal scenario, we want the seller to stay involved with the business after closing as long as the note is outstanding. That doesn't mean that the seller is actively involved in managing the business, but for example, we typically require that the seller be given quarterly financial statements so that the seller can see how the business is doing, making sure that he or she is going to be able to be paid back. Also, it's very important here for the seller to spend some time qualifying that buyer. And we've found over time that if the buyer feels that the purchase price is a stretch, they're less likely to give ideal terms. So if they're paying more than they think they should, or they're at the top of their range, they're less likely to give those ideal terms. So here we have an example. Victor wants to sell his stock in VDS Inc., which is an S corporation, to his employee Kathy for $4 million. Kathy got divorced several years ago, and her husband took half of her stuff. And as a result of giving half of her stuff away and poor investment performance, Kathy ended up in bankruptcy. That means that traditional lenders will be obviously very reluctant to give her a loan. but Kathy plans to be certified as a woman-owned business after the purchase. That's going to result in her being able to get additional contracts and potentially raise the company's revenue. So she went to the SBA. The SBA offered to lend her 75% of the purchase price if Victor would take back a seller note for 25%. Victor was willing to take back a seller note for 25% if he gets security. So what's security? Well, her house, her investments, her other assets. Unfortunately, as part of the SBA loan, Kathy had to pledge all those assets to the SBA. So the parties agreed that Victor's going to purchase a permanent life insurance policy insuring Kathy's life. Victor's going to be the owner and beneficiary, and the company's going to be able to pay the premiums. So the parties enter into a collateral assignment split dollar arrangement. Victor, as I said, is the owner and beneficiary of the policy. He collaterally assigns an interest in the policy back to VDS. VDS pays the entire premium and treats it as a loan to Victor. If Kathy dies during the outstanding period of the note, the company is reimbursed for the loans it made plus interest, and Victor keeps the rest of the proceeds to make him whole. So let's talk about recruiting and retention for a little bit, because this is very important these days. Overall, in January of this year, the unemployment rate was 6.3%. But with the businesses that we work with, we're not seeing that type of unemployment. In fact, with our professional and business services, talent is extremely tight. Generally, it's poaching someone from a competitor or another company in a different industry. So we spend a lot of time here focusing on the use of deferred compensation to help with recruiting and retention. So I know that for those of you that attended yesterday, I know that Andrew Rinn from Emeritus was speaking about deferred compensation, and I know that he covered traditional non-qualified deferred compensation, and I believe he covered 162 bonus. So I decided to cover equity plans, because really this is what we're doing every day. So equity plans. First, we're going to talk about a plan where the participant actually ends up with equity at the end of the day. Then we'll move on to two types of plans where the participant ends up with cash, and the value of that cash is calculated, the value of the cash that passes to the participant is calculated based on the value of the company. So first, restricted equity. Here we're talking about restricted stock in a corporation or restricted units in an LLC. The participant will receive that equity subject to a vesting schedule. The vesting schedule could be time vesting. In other words, it could say, here's 100 shares of stock, participant, and you're going to vest in 20% of that stock every year for the next 5 years. It could be cliff vesting, where it says at the end of 5 years, you vest 100% in that stock. It could also be performance-based, and it could be the company's performance or the individual's performance. So for example, maybe the agreement says you will vest in this stock when the company EBITDA reaches a certain amount. Normally, restricted equity is taxed when it vests. So in other words, in my example where it vests 20% per year for the next 5 years, that participant would be taxed 20% every year, and it would be the then current value. So if the value of the stock is going up, obviously the participant is going to pay more tax over time. But the participant has another option, and that is to make what's referred to as a Section 83B election. Section 83B refers to that section of the Internal Revenue Code. An 83B election allows the participant to be taxed on the entire grant in the year that it was granted. Be taxed on the entire grant in the year that it was granted. Now, if later they don't vest in the stock, that would be problematic, because restricted equity plans say if you don't make it to vesting, you forfeit your shares. But if the participant thinks that they're going to be there for the vesting event and they think that the value of the stock will be higher at that point, it makes some sense to make an 83B election. They don't have a lot of time to think about it though, because that 83B election has to be made within 30 days of the grant. So that is restricted equity. Then we move on to phantom equity. And as it sounds, phantom equity is not real stock. It is the right to a cash payment in the future, the value of which will be calculated based on the value of company equity. So in other words, we have some triggering events in a plan, one of which is, let's say, a change of control. At that point in time, when a change of control occurs, the participant would get an amount of money calculated based on the stock value or the equity value. Typically, well, these plans are subject to Section 409A of the Internal Revenue Code, so they can only pay out upon the occurrence of particular events, such as death, disability, change of control. They can pay out at a particular point in the future, so they're somewhat flexible. They can be issued to the participants with or without what's referred to as dividend equivalent rights. Dividend equivalent rights are the right to a cash payment. So when the company makes a distribution to the owners of actual equity, if a phantom equity owner has dividend equivalent rights, they would also get a distribution as though they actually owned equity in the company. Normally, phantom equity is taxed when it is paid. That's good because with phantom equity, then the participant has the money with which to pay the tax. Now, phantom equity plans are what I refer to as full value plans. My phantom equity plan, we're giving the full value of a share of stock or a unit in an LLC. But there's another type of plan that only rewards upside, and that's an appreciation rights plan. In an appreciation rights plan, the participant is entitled to the value of the difference in equity between the value at the grant date and the value at the date that a triggering event occurs. So for example, change of control of the company. That's going to be our triggering event. Grant date is today. The equity in the company is worth $5 today. The equity value will be paid out at change of control. At the time of the change of control, the equity value is $10 per share. That participant is entitled to $5 per share. The difference between the value today, the grant date, and the value at the time of the change of control. Again, normally appreciation rights are taxed when paid. So where do these come into play? They can come into play in a variety of situations, but let me tell you about one that we see quite frequently. So here we have Pharmanew. Pharmanew has been owned and operated by the Jones family for over 80 years. Pharmanew recently converted its production facility, which traditionally has made packaging for drugs, and is making cutting-edge COVID-19 vaccine delivery supplies for one of the major pharmaceutical companies. The company's current CEO, Dan Jones, wishes to market their unique products to other pharmaceutical companies, but he needs a foot in the door. He needs an experienced sales and marketing executive to make that work. So Pharmanew is attempting to recruit Lee Kim, who's the Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Pfizer, a large pharmaceutical company. Kim's interested in the opportunity, which includes a large incentive compensation package, but he wants equity in Pharmanew as part of his compensation. All right, let's hold it right there. Why would Kim want equity in Pharmanew? It's not publicly traded. He's not going to be able to go out and sell his equity on the open market. Why would he want it? Well, clearly, Kim is thinking that Pharmanew may at some point in the future be acquired by somebody else, at which point he would get a payoff. Or he may be thinking, well, he can negotiate And that equity can be repurchased by the company when he retires, for example, or if he dies or becomes disabled. So there are reasons why Lee Kim would be interested in equity in this family-owned business. The flip side of that is the family-owned business doesn't want to give equity to non-family members. So in this case, Pharma News Advisor suggests putting in a phantom stock plan. If Lee dies, becomes disabled, retires, or if the company is sold, under the plan, Lee will receive 5% of the company value. So he's still getting a payment based on the value of the equity, which is really most of the time what the executive wants. It doesn't really matter if that takes the form of actual stock in the company or phantom stock, typically. So under this plan, if he leaves there is a vesting period that they put in place for Lee's interest under the plan. It's 5-year time vesting. So 1% a year for 5 years. If he leaves during the vesting period, any unvested stock is forfeited. Also, any unvested phantom stock is forfeited. And if he's terminated for cause, he loses everything. So, and that's pretty typical. The other point I should have made when we were talking about restricted stock, anytime that your client is going to give an employee stock, they need to make sure that they put a shareholder restriction agreement in place. So if the employee leaves, the company's not negotiating buying back the stock at that point in time. They need to put the restriction agreement in place when the stock is granted. So let's talk a little bit about management succession, because this has been a hot topic during COVID as well. And most of the time if you've heard me speak before, I speak a lot about buy-sell agreements. I speak a lot about, selling your company to your employees, but we don't talk enough about management succession. And this has really come to a head with a couple of our clients during COVID. So what are we really talking about here? Basically, it's that second bullet. Who would perform your functions if you couldn't come to work tomorrow? Because we've had that happen over the last year. We've had owners who became ill and passed away, leaving the company in turmoil. So we are concentrating more with our clients now on management succession, not just business succession, not just selling the equity in the company, but who's going to manage the company. So generally, we start that conversation with owners and key employees. What are the 3 key functions that you perform? And who's going to perform those functions if you don't show up tomorrow? And what would happen if someone wasn't performing those functions? And I can tell you, when we're working with especially the key employees, even more so than the owners in some cases, that bullet, would the failure to perform those functions affect the business's performance? The answer is 100% of the time, of course. If you are speaking with the owner, the questions are, if you are unable to permanently perform those functions, should the company be sold? Should a replacement for you be hired as soon as possible? And should the duties that you have now be assigned to existing management? Now, of course, these questions are questions for owners who are actively involved in the business. We always do have some owners who have turned everything over to their management team. Then we're talking about the management team. So what if the owner's response is that the business should be sold? Then the questions become, who's going to run the business in the interim? And not only who's going to run it, but who's going to run it successfully? Because we don't want the business to lose value after the death of the owner. Second question, will key customers leave after an owner's death? In some cases, the answer is no, because it's the company and not the owner. In other cases, the answer is the owner was the company. So if you've ever seen the movie Tommy Boy, and I know some of you out there have, if you recall, Tommy Boy's dad, who passed away, basically was the company, and a lot of his key customers planned to leave and go elsewhere after Tommy Boy's dad died. And the rest of the movie was about how Tommy Boy had to, and his companion had to convince them not to do that. Will key employees leave after an owner's death? to work for a competitor, start a competing business. This is again where the deferred compensation plans can come in handy to tie those key employees to the business. What if the answer is a replacement should be hired? Well, then we're asking the owners and key management what attributes that replacement would need to have in order to succeed. What is the most important background? And that answer is not the same in every case. For example, I have a client who is a very large redistributor of food. So he buys product from the manufacturers, the food companies. Let's say he buys from Stouffer's, just by way of example. He brings it into his warehouse and then resells to grocery stores or other distributors. He has been in this industry since the 1970s, and it's a very closed industry. So he has all the key contacts. If he needed to be replaced, it would be very difficult for somebody from another industry to replace him because of the key contact piece. It's a very tight-knit community. On the other hand, I have other companies where the answer is clearly the person needs to be an entrepreneur. They need to have big ideas. They can't just be an operations person. So this group of attributes is going to be different in every single client case. What if existing management should own the business? Does that mean that one individual should have the control that the owner had? Or should control be vested in a committee or in the owner's spouse or in the owner's descendants? I work with a lot of family businesses, and I can tell you that if the owner's spouse or descendants have not been involved in the business, it is exceptionally difficult for them to take over at an owner's death. So should the owner's family be allowed to make key decisions, or should they have to consult with a group of managers? Typically, we recommend the latter. I had a case a couple of years ago. The business owner knew he was ill. He had cancer, and he knew that it was probably going to be terminal. His wife had never been involved in the business. They did not have children. And we ended up setting up basically an advisory trustee committee under his trust. And he had asked a couple friends who were longtime members of the same industry to serve in this basically advisory role. So their job is to advise the spouse about the business and really get into the financials and make sure that everything is performing properly. So that's been a fine option in some cases as well. We've also spent a lot of time on management succession. And what does that mean? Well, what's going to happen in an emergency? So if you're working with a client and the client is key to the business operations, what's the emergency management plan if that client can't show up to work? If they get COVID and they're sick, they're a long hauler, they die. And generally, we've seen a lot more interest by our corporate clients in documenting these emergency management succession plans. So for example, we work with another financial services company, and that financial services company, one person is in charge, and basically she was actively seeking some private investment in their company. And as part of that, the potential investor said, well, what is your emergency management plan? She didn't have one. So she came up to us, we worked through who should do what. If she couldn't show up to work, these duties should be performed by this key employee, these duties should be done by that key employee. We documented all in the minutes of the company, and the investor was satisfied that there was a plan in place if she couldn't show up for work the next day. So let's talk a little bit about the Biden tax proposals. I'm not going to bore you by going through the whole thing, but I am going to point out a couple things that are changing some of the techniques that we're using with our clients. So first, on the individual income tax side, we know that Biden wants to raise the rate back to 39.6%. Basically, Biden wants to wipe out everything that happened under the Trump plan and then some. So in addition, proposals include a 12.4% Social Security tax on income over $400,000, limiting itemized deductions for that group of taxpayers, restoring the PEAS limitation, which makes your itemized deductions less valuable, phasing out the QBI deduction. So if your client or you have been taking deductions on pass-through income, that would go away. And for taxpayers with incomes over $1 million, capital gains and qualified dividends would be taxed at ordinary income rates, that is 39.6%. On the estate tax side, we're also going into the Wayback Machine back to 2009 with a reduced exemption of $3.5 million. Not clear if that would be indexed for inflation or not, 45% tax rate, eliminating basis step up. And remember, I told you I was on the phone with another professional this morning, the one who no longer has a phone. We are working on a gift tax return where the stock that was gifted was passed to our clients in the 1970s by virtue of the death of her father-in-law. So we are trying to figure out what the basis of the stock was in the 1970s. And I can tell you, it is almost impossible. Also, there have been proposals about a possible tax on appreciated property, that the appreciation would be taxed at the time of a gift or at the time of death, since there's eliminating the basis step up. So it's not good news on the income tax side or the estate tax side. Of course, you know, government's given away a lot of money in 2020 and 2021. So they have to figure out a way to make that up somehow. So these increases, when clients ask me what I think the odds are that we're going to see a tax increase, I'd say the odds are probably 100%. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions.
Kathleen, breaking it to the crowd that there's going to be that you believe there's 100% chance that we're going to see a tax increase. People went silent there. Couple questions for you. In your opinion, what is the best form of deferred compensation for clients who are trying to recruit an executive?
Gosh, that's a great question. I'm not sure there's really a best type. The first question that I always ask a client is, are you willing to give equity in the company? Because if you're not willing to give equity, that takes things like restricted stock off the table. Are you willing to deal with some level of complication? Because, you know, that can also take some plans off the table. Are you willing to deal with 409A? That can take some plans off the table. So I'm not sure that there's any best kind, but there's typically a best type in the client's situation that will meet their objectives. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. And then earlier, when you were talking about seller financing, is there an insurable interest problem because a seller is no longer a shareholder of the company?
Another great question. No. The reason is because the seller, even though he sold his company, he still has an economic interest in the buyer, right? Because the buyer owes him a significant amount of money, $1 million. So there's not an insurable interest problem because they have a business arrangement, business dealings.
Excellent. Well, Kathleen, we really appreciate you carving out some of your time today. Really, really insightful information. And again, we appreciate not just you, but also our relationship and you helping and coordinate that with FSP and what NAIFA and FSP are doing in coordination, not just this week, but moving forward throughout the year and hopefully beyond that. So we, again, appreciate your time and thank you for spending some time with us here this afternoon. For the rest of the attendees, we're going to take another short break. We're going to be back with Ryan Pinney and Cheryl Brown Hickerson to talk about modernizing your practice, most likely leveraging technology. These two are both gurus in that space. So we're excited to have them. Again, a short break. We'll be back at it at the top of the hour and look forward to reconnecting and seeing everybody here in a few minutes.